Uh, Welcome, everyone. Today's meeting is on Zoom, and the Zoom application will notify you that this meeting is being recorded. Press continue to Zoom application stay in the meeting. Use the raise your hand feature on Zoom when you would like to speak on an item, and to also lower your hand when you are finished speaking on that. Please unmute when called to speak and mute yourself when you are done speaking. If you're calling in by phone, identify yourself by name before speaking on an item. Press *9 on your phone to raise and lower your hand, and press *6 if you are participating by phone to unmute yourself. Thank you very much, and I call this meeting to order. And attendance, Maria?
Okay, Chair Shahal,
Present.
Member Park.
Here.
And Member Jane.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, and we have one item on the consent calendar, approval of the June 3rd, 2024 Governance and Ethics Committee meeting minutes. Is there any questions, any suggestions on that item? Not, can I have a motion to approve that, please?
I'll make a motion to approve. I'll make a motion to approve.
And I will second.
Okay, thank you. So roll call vote? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? None. Aye. Okay. Going forward, public presentation. Is there anybody on the Zoom? I don't see anybody over here.
No one has their hands raised.
Nobody has their hands. Okay, so we're moving along. We are moving pretty fast. Okay, item number 2, 24-6 to 7. Review policy and procedure 049, community grant policy. City manager, you have some comments on that?
Sure. Thank you, Chair Jahal, Javon Grogan, City Manager. Before we begin with this presentation on the proposed changes to the community grant program, which we're calling a policy update, I want to take some time to share the context for why this item is being brought to you. The community grant program, as you know, is still fairly new, having started in 2018. As the program moved out of its infancy, staff identified several gaps that could be improved upon to create a more impactful program. A little over 1 year ago, staff begun the process of updating the policy in response to lessons learned with the goal of improving the overall process for applicants by clarifying expectations and guidelines for the program, as well as with the desire to increase equitable access for applicants to the events that are funded to benefit all of Santa Clara. With that, I will pass the presentation over to Laura Sunseri, a management analyst with the City Manager's Office, who has been leading up this grant program for the past 1.5 years. She has provided amazing, stellar concierge service to all of our customers and really strives to make the program accessible to as many people as possible. So with that, Laura, will you present the item?
Thank you, City Manager Grogan, and good afternoon, committee. As City Manager Grogan said, my name is Laura Sunseri, and I manage the Community Grant Program's application process. And I'm glad to be before you today to discuss this item. The Community Grant Policy established a standardized process and procedures which formed the Community Grant Program. The policy outlines eligibility requirements, instructions for applicants, and an application that is submitted to the City Manager's Office. The applications are then reviewed and approved by staff. Next slide. The Community Grant Program launched in 2018, and the program awards up to $10,000 per applicant per fiscal year for qualifying events and activities that provide a public benefit to Santa Clara residents. The Community Grant Program also supports youth groups to travel and compete in state, national, or international games or performances. Next slide. The Community Grant Program has awarded community grants for various community events such as fun runs, social impact summits, car shows, cultural events, fundraisers, community discussions, and youth group championship competitions for various sports, music, and academic competitions. Next slide. So now we arrive to the purpose of our discussion today, which is to review the policy and discuss proposed amendments. As City Manager Grogan explained in his introduction, staff has identified gaps that could be improved upon to create a more impactful program and increase equitable access for applicants and events that benefit Santa Clara. The process to propose updates to the policy began over a year ago in order to promote altruism, creativity, and inclusivity, which aims to expand the program and encourage applicants to provide creative community events and activities that directly benefit the Santa Clara community. It also aims to provide better and enhanced customer service. The proposed policy updates provide clarifying language and clear expectations for staff, applicants, grantees, and returning applicants to refer to throughout all stages of the application process. And lastly, the proposed policy amendments implement additional protections to the city to reduce risk. Next slide. As we go through these next slides, there are 6 proposed policy updates for the discussion today. And as we go through them, the column labeled current language has the provision in the policy as it is currently written. And the proposed language column is the proposed updated or added language. The full current and proposed policy are attached to this item's report. The first proposed update before you is to add language in the policy to indicate that applicants have a financial need for grant funding. This proposed update would require applicants to provide supporting information in the application process in order to learn more about the applicant's ability to provide meaningful events to the city. For example, if approved, the application could include a field where the applicant has the opportunity to describe their organization or group or themselves. Perhaps they are a nonprofit volunteer-run organization that relies on grant funding to increase positive community impact. Staff can follow up with the applicant as necessary, which is already allowable in the current policy. Next slide, please. The next proposed policy update concerns prohibited activity. This proposed policy update aims to outline language to clearly establish prohibited activity and consequences for violating the community grant policy and establish clear expectations of the grantee. Policy violations, including failure to follow the terms in the approved application, misuse of grant funds, failure to return unspent grant funds, and failure to provide the appropriate verification documentation could result in the grantee having to return the grant award and may be deemed ineligible to apply for future grant opportunities through the community grant program. Grantees may also be ineligible to apply for future grant opportunities through this program if the required documentation or unspent grant funds are never submitted or returned, or if the required documentation or unspent grant funds are insufficient or submitted outside of the required time frame. Next slide, please. The next proposed policy update highlights community impact. This proposed policy aims to collect more information from the grantee in the post-event process in an effort to measure the success of the event and how Santa Clara residents were served. Additionally, if the applicant applies for grant funding through the community grant program in the future, the past event success can be measured when considering approval or denial of a future application for grant funding. This is a provision which already exists in the current policy. Next slide, please. Okay. Now we have come to the eligibility criteria section in the policy. The eligibility criteria is an essential element to this policy because it outlines the specific requirements in order to determine eligibility for the community grant program. The proposed changes in this section aim to enhance the eligibility requirements to clearly capture the intention of the community grant program, which is to encourage and support eligible community events and activities in the city of Santa Clara and support youth groups traveling to and participating in championship games or performances in which both categories directly benefit the Santa Clara community. The proposed language also replaces a requirement that applications align to city council goals. Council goals are adopted to prioritize and focus the efforts of the city's government and may not be applicable to the community events and activities that participate in the community grant program. Instead, the proposed policy asks that applicants demonstrate that the event, activity, or competition will align with established grant focus areas, which are Santa Clara youth identity, culture, representation, equity, Santa Clara youth, and community service. Additionally, the proposed updated eligibility criteria asks clarifying language to an existing provision to include a definition of political and religious purposes consistent with federal and state laws regarding limitations on use of public funds. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the proposed eligibility criteria, which includes clarifying language that community events activities must be held within the city of Santa Clara, replaces council goals with the grant focus areas, and defines political and religious purposes consistent with federal and state law. Next slide, please. Thank you. The next proposed policy update includes updates to eligible community events and activities. This proposed policy update proposes to expand the range of eligible events and activities allowable under the program to include workshops, programs, and projects. This is in an effort to promote a fair and equitable application process and encourage applicants to come up with creative ways to provide community benefits to the Santa Clara community. Next slide, please. And finally, our last proposed policy update is intended to provide assistance during the application process and outlines the types of expenses that grant funding can and cannot be spent towards. The current policy outlines allowable expenses such as city permits, fees, and services, and other event costs, including venue, food, and stage or tent rentals. The proposed policy update to this language incorporates additional expenses that are essential to the success of the event to include certain marketing and promotion expenses and incidental one-time expenses specifically for the event. The proposed policy update also includes language to establish ineligible expenses so that grant funds are not spent towards gifts, giveaway items, and programmatic expenses such as an applicant's staff time, consulting services, and payment of hired staff. Next slide, please. And with that, this item has been brought to the Governance and Ethics Committee today for review and discussion and to approve amendments, if any, to the community grant policy and bring forth to City Council for consideration and approval. And one last slide, please. Thank you so much for your time today. And I now open the discussion, and myself, City Manager Javon Grogan, City Attorney Glenn Googans, and Acting Assistant City Manager Michelle Templeton are available to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate your presentation and good changes. Committee Member Jane.
Yeah, I noticed that if people engage in prohibited activity, they would be barred from future grants, but there was no time frame, and that I could find. It seems to me that, you know, an organization may have engaged in some sort of unauthorized activity, but then like 5 years down the road, the board would have completely changed, the membership would have completely changed, and then it's a different organization. So it didn't seem like that was in there. It just barred it from all future. So that didn't make sense to me. And then I wanted to understand, like, after people are granted this, this grant, sometimes organizations will come back, if it's an event like a tournament or something, they'll come back and give a presentation to the council. I don't know if we want to require those presentations. I would actually prefer, because we would have a lot of those, just have them write up a like minimum 500-word description of the event that would be made available to the public, just so that we know how we're spending that. And for future years, people could look at that and see, you know, what kinds of activities were funded. And then some sort of maybe restriction on repeating the grants. Like, will this organization get it every year, or do you have to get it once and then wait 3 years before you get it again? Just seems like that would be a better way to spread the wealth out. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Councilmember Jane. With regard to limiting the time that a grantee could be suspended for violating any other prohibited activities, I think that's a good add, and we can have a dialogue around what's appropriate, whether it's a 2, 3, or 5 year. Certainly, in perpetuity would be too long. With regard to a write-up, certainly, we can add that. I think what makes most sense is to put it on the city's website. And so 500-word write-up of the outcome of the event that would then be posted on the city's website is something that would be a appropriate add. And with regard to repeating grants, certainly that's something that the committee could consider. I think our history has been not all of the funds have been applied for annually. And so even right now, I think all of the funds for the current year have not been spent. And so if we're in that situation, would the committee desire us to say, even though we have funds, you did receive funds in a prior year, so you're not eligible? And right now, the awardees are limited for completely staff discretion. And so that would be adding a criteria to limit a group to receive funds because they had it in the prior year, but certainly willing to take any feedback with regard to that.
So again, like in the 49er agreements, I kind of don't like hard limits of $10,000 because 5 years from now, $10,000 won't be $10,000. So those kinds of things should be adjusted annually. But the thing about it is it should be maybe a way we market it. If we allocate $100,000 and it's not being used by the end of the year, then I'm sure there's lots of organizations that want that money. They just don't know about applying for it. But I also don't want to use up all the money at the beginning of the year, because during the year, school teams will qualify for tournaments, and you want to be able to have a reserve so that you can grant almost to the last date, because the timeframes are very short. Like you apply for the money like within 2 weeks of having to go, and it's, you know, the city manager gets to approve it. It used to come to council, but the timeframes are so short. I'll just give you an example. In the case of the robotics, was we didn't actually find out that we were selected to go until really like 3 weeks before we had to go. So then we quickly scrambled to apply. So those are my other comments. Thank you.
Committee Member Park.
Yeah.
I actually have the same question on how do we rotate applicants? We often have grantees that seem to be grandfathered in. How do we ensure as many different organizations as possible? And I do hear what staff said, like, what if we have money left over? I don't think that we would deny an applicant money just because they have applied before, but at the same time, it would be to encourage more variety, more diversity in applicants, right? I think that if the best case would be we have more applicants than we have money for all the time. That would give us a ability to rotate. I do hear what committee member Jane says, which is giving the money away really early or at once, at one time. There are a lot of issues. I do see that, as committee member Jane said, we could have people asking for money or not needing funds until they need funds, and we don't have there's no time limit. There is no set time for when that happens. I also want to know, because we have a lot of things in here where they say, well, we worry about misuse. How will the grantees be monitored? Which is when we talk about financial need, how do we determine financial need? When we say that there's misuse, how do we look into misuse? Does the city provide or have an avenue for complaints of people in the programs, people, other things? I don't know if we don't have ways to take feedback, I don't know how we're going to enforce some of the things that we put into this policy. I also know that in the past, the community grants, we set them at $10,000. And I think one of the reasons we set them to $10,000 is because the cost of determining who should get the grants, the cost of giving the grants is pretty high. I think it's above $5,000 just to determine how much money, how the money should be spent. I believe that like 3 years ago, we made some changes because we wanted to make sure that for the cost, we are giving away as much money as we can. Like if we give out $500 each time and it costs us more than $500 to determine who should get the grant, then it doesn't seem like the best use of funds. But is there a way for people or communities, organizations that don't need $10,000 to get funding? Last thing I want to say is, I know that community grants used to be reviewed by community. Right now, we have open meetings where we get very little feedback. We get very little input. But there used to be, for example, on CAC used to review, and CAC used to give reports on some of the grants that were given. And I see no reason why we can't use these organizations. I mean, we have a requirement that it is reviewed by the public, and we've made it simple and easy by saying, well, we're just going to have an open city council meeting and people can talk about it then. But what I've seen is that doesn't engage the public, and there has been almost no input on the grants that have been given because of that. But, I kind of liked it when it was a topic at a community meeting and the community was not just engaged, not just possible to give input. It wasn't just possible to give input, but they actually put it on the agenda. They agendized it, made it important that they gave input. I think that also encourages smaller groups that don't know about these funds to come forward. If they're involved, if we've got another committee outside of staff, we've got other committees outside of staff actively looking for applicants, actively looking for other people. Like, I understand that we have a method by the rule of law, we are correct, but I think that we can do it better by spirit of community grants to involve the public more, like we used to have. Thank you.
So I think committee member Park is confusing CDBG grants with community grants.
No.
CDBG grants do have a very large amount of reporting requirements. It costs about $7,500 to create those reports. These are just community grants from our fund, and they have almost no overhead requirements. And they don't have any requirements for public meetings like CDBG.
Understood. And just to clarify, I specifically did not use CDBG because I didn't want to limit it to to just CDBG funds. The clarification about the money spent, that's well taken. But at the same time, I was going to ask a little bit more about community involvement for community grants. Like oftentimes the community comes to city council meetings and they're told what the grants are going to be. And the process is largely contained to staff and applicants. It would be really nice for public to come in and say, well, this is what we'd like to see in our communities as well. And maybe even find or help fund organizations that could help with those, with the community needs. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Committee Member Park and Committee Member Jane. Just a response to a few of those, and I think some of those we should turn back over to the committee for dialogue because we hear two different things coming from the committee. With regard to grants over, being able to give grants over $10,000 or give grants under $10,000, council member or committee member Park, you mentioned what if a group doesn't need 10,000? We can certainly give grants lower than 10,000. I think committee member Jane mentioned that sometimes there may be a group that needs more than $10,000. And so is there the ability to do that? Right now, within the program guidelines, there's not the ability. Currently, the program is funded, as mentioned in the presentation, with $90,000 a year. Now, we do have the additional $50,000 that will be coming to the community grant program for the next several years from the 49ers grant. So 3 years have been identified. And so that would increase that 90 to 140. Certainly, we can have discussions about increasing the amount to more than 10,000. I do believe the amount was set at 10,000 because even at 140, it's still relatively a low funding amount. And so the desire to be able to fund as many groups as possible, but certainly we can talk about increasing that amount. There was a number of comments with regard to public input on the grants. So as we said before, and as we've talked about, this program was set up specifically, and I think purposely, to be a staff review and decision process to allow for the efficient administration of the grants. It is done with existing staffing, so there's not an additional outside cost to implement the grant program. As well as I think Committee Member Jane provided an example of a club that finds out that they're going to a tournament, having an efficient process that doesn't involve scheduling a public meeting, having public input, and on some level, not having a decision point at a council or a public body certainly allows for efficiency. And there were a number of comments about grant or grant amounts at city council meetings. Certainly, I've seen a number of clubs that have received a grant that come to the council and just say thank you, not a requirement. Other times they may be given a ceremonial award because they went to a tournament and won. We want to recognize them. And as a part of that presentation, they mentioned that they received a grant. But there currently is no requirement to either have a public meeting before the grant is awarded or to come to the city council meeting. And certainly there could be additional dialogue on that if the committee desires. With regard to a feedback or complaints, there was a question on we're proposing the ability to prohibit people that misuse the grant funds. How will we find out, and is there the ability for someone to alert us of any misuse? And so I'll turn that over to our program staff. I know that certainly we'll take in any complaints that we receive, but if our staff could talk about that item a little further.
Yeah, thank you for the question. In relation to the misuse of funds, it's a very clear system that we have currently, and it's primarily focused on how the funds are used, which is why we really wanted to get this policy update done so there's clarity on what is allowable and what's not allowable. And so the misuse of funds really comes in the post-event program or whatever it is that the community group used the money for audit. And so that's why it's really important that we're adding in the component of making sure that that audit happens and that they're giving all of the information back that we're asking as a requirement. And then that way we can have a really clear use of funds. And then just wanted to answer the question in relation to making sure groups know about these grants. There has been limited community outreach about these grants historically. And one of the things we started discussing this January was a communications plan for how to get this information out to the public. We really wanted this policy to be revised and in place before we push it out further. And then as City Manager Grogan mentioned, there will now be a larger pot for the community. So what we might have the committee consider is looking at the use of funds over the course of the year and revisiting it in a year to see if we are in fact running out of funds at the end of each year or not. And once we start this outreach and this push in the community to help people know that this grant is out there, and then starting a webpage that shows who we've granted in the past. If we were to add some kind of a report out that's included in that website, along with the outreach that we do to the community about it being there, that could help.
If I may, I thank you for all the comments and the suggestion from the staff. I think Committee Member Jane was asking to increase the 10% according to, I understood, according to the inflation. Can we add that, like current 2024 $10,000, and we can increase it by, say, 3% every year? And within discretion of the city manager, next year, $10,300 will be automatically increase of 3,000 till the time we reset the base amount of 10,000. So that would be my suggestion, to keep increasing it, a grant one. And second one on repeating, the point is very valid, like a school district, like any school program which happens in the late quarter, right? So can we do this as a suggestion? We reserve around 25% of the fund for the last quarter. We can distribute 75% within the first 3 quarters of our financial year, but we keep 25% for the last quarter, so that in case of those things happen, we have that fund for them. I know right now we are not even using the full, but if we can use that suggestion, that, okay, we will have that, we will not miss those type of opportunities for that. So that's my second suggestion on that. And communication wise, I think it's, as Michelle mentioned, that we will be advertising more. I would also suggest, like our commissions should get a quarterly statement. Hey, this is the amount left right now, 50,000 amount left, and this is the website. Next quarter, 25,000 left. Each commission should get that information, just as an information only, so that they can also advertise and share with the community about it, basically. And what else? My other question was, there's no carry forward on this thing. Whatever lapses is lapses, right? If we are not using out of the 90,000 plus 50,000, whatever it be, if it doesn't get granted this particular financial year, it doesn't go forward, right? Carry forward the balance of the amount. So if we can have that provision also, that would be nice. Yeah. So those are my suggestions and questions, basically.
So currently the funds do not roll over every budget year. We can certainly address that through our budgeting process and roll over any unspent funds to build up a balance. With regard to a reservation of a certain percent, you took the suggestion that I think we were all thinking, which is let's reserve some percent. I don't know if 25% is the right amount, so I'd want to talk to staff to see is that the right amount, but certainly given how championships and other school programs. And I think we need to think about what, is it the fourth quarter? Is it the end of the school year? And so we can have some dialogue with staff about at what time of the year are we reserving X amount. With regard to increasing the funds by year, certainly we can do a inflationary increase. I think part of the challenge is because of the amount we're talking about. If we do 3%, it's not a ton more money. And so we may want to think about increasing by either how much the budget goes up by, right? Because if we increase by $100, $500, but we're not increasing that $90,000 that we give, we will be decreasing the amount of agencies that can be funded. And so we can certainly think about whether we increase by $100, $200, or $500 at a certain clip, but we would need to make sure that our budget increases for the program so that we're not reducing the number of agencies. And we are in a point now where we will be getting an additional $50,000, but I think the goal for that 50 was to fund more organizations. So I don't know that we want to increase the amount with that 50,000 in mind, but certainly we can take back that suggestion. And I think that's it.
And I'm sorry, I missed one more question. I know we are talking about, our previous policy did not have the 501c anywhere in it. Now we are incorporating 501c. So I have two questions on that. Does the nonprofit organization has to be a 501c, or in case of like a particular group of students from a particular club, they might not have a 501c, but they might be very much eligible and as per our policy. So I hope that is not restrictive, that 501c is not a must. So that's my first question. And second question is, if the 501c is registered outside the city, but it's benefiting the city of Raleigh, are they eligible for that matter? So those are my two questions. And another one before I forget, on the repeating grantees, basically, can we roll them over into Q4? Let's say there's a repeating and we still have a Q4 budget left, and we don't want to give them every year, but after, let's say, 2 years or 3 years, we want to keep others in the pipeline. So we can reduce their priority at such that we can put them in the last quarter, and last quarter, like last month of the last quarter, and if funds are still left, we can consider them, something like that, if they're eligible, good eligible candidates. So that's my another suggestion, basically. Thank you.
So thank you for those questions. Yes, for the 501c3, first, if it's a youth group, they do not have to qualify under that 501c3 because they are with a school or a club. So that's kind of a separate pot of the grant. As far as a 501 that is not Santa Clara City 501, that they are allowed to apply for the grant as long as they meet the rest of the criteria, that it is within the city of Santa Clara, the event or the program that they're running is within the city of Santa Clara, and it benefits the community of Santa Clara. And then to your question of a wait list, I might pose back a question or just some food for thought on those groups that might be coming in at the end of the year and we don't have enough funds for. I might suggest we revisit this after a year once we've started the community outreach to see whether or not that is an issue that we're having, and then determine some kind of way to create a parking lot for groups that maybe have received several years in a row and we're trying to open it up to more groups, or if there's groups that haven't and we are close to out of funds. So I might suggest that we revisit that after a year of solid community outreach with the new pot of money that we have for this program to see if we're in a situation where we need to address that issue.
Oh, I'm perfectly fine with that. Yeah. And Maria, is there anybody on the public?
Do not have any hands raised, but did anyone want to speak to this item? Please raise your hand. No hands raised.
Okay, yeah, please.
I just want one clarification. So you said that you would like reports, the post-event reports, and those will be, and the audits that happen, we're going to make sure that the audits happen. Will those audits be available publicly? Or did you say that we'd like to post them on the website, or they are currently available for us to look at?
So the audits are done internally by city staff, and then we use those audits to then reach back out And again, as City Manager Grogan mentioned, it is a concierge style service. We do a lot of high touch with our grantees and to make sure that if they haven't submitted something that is required, that we ensure that there isn't some reason they weren't able to. We work with them and then make sure that we have all that documentation to show that they use the funds as they said they would under the allowable expenses that they can use them for in the grant. And so that's how the audit process happens. That is not posted, that would not be posted on the website.
And just to expand upon that, the term audit is used, but it's not what we typically think of as a audit or an external document or a report. For example, if a group is provided a grant to go to a tournament, they may need to submit the receipts, the plane tickets, things like that, so that we know what the money was spent on, and we wouldn't post that information on the website. And so that's the type of staff audit of the expenses that we're talking about.
Okay, but if people had questions on an organization or how money was spent, what would we be able to give them?
So certainly someone could call the program staff and ask a question. If it was something elaborate, they would really need to submit a Public Information Act, a PRA request, and we would process that as per allowed. If the documents can be released, we will certainly release them.
The committee members, oh, you have something more?
No, given that there were no questions from the community or the public, my question is, we had a number of modifications. What is your recommendation, that you incorporate those and come back, or that we make a motion to incorporate those now?
My recommendation is that you make a motion to incorporate them. That way we can proceed to the city council with the full recommendation to amend the policy. I have a list of them. I was going to read them out to make sure that we fully understood and there was agreement with the changes that we talked about. Yeah. And with that, I want to, one more thing, Chair Jahal, you mentioned sending a announcement or periodic advertisement to the commissions when we have funds remaining. I just want to proffer a change to that, which is that we would push out information publicly on our various social media channels. Sometimes our commissions it's like talking to inside baseball, people that know about the city. They serve on a commission, and we want to make sure that we're doing a very broad outreach to the community. And so we would certainly include them in the communique, but the communication would go to a broader audience.
Okay, thank you. That should be okay. And would you mind sharing the suggestion so that we can make it a part of the motion?
Chair Chahal, one additional thought. I understand that our current practice, which I endorse, is that whenever monies are provided, we require recipients to enter into a simple grant agreement that has them accepting kind of the terms of policy. It also helps with potential enforcement and follow-up issues. Not working?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just not, I have to eat it, I guess. And so one element that we would formalize too, in addition to the items that City Manager Grogan just identified, would be a provision that makes it explicit that the grantees will enter into a grant agreement that acknowledges, their obligation to comply with the terms of the program.
Thank you.
A summary of the things that were talked about that I think the committee is in agreement on, which is for staff to identify a process to increase the grant amount on a periodic basis, being mindful of the desire not to limit the number of groups that receive grants, but wanting to increase the amount of the grant over time, recognizing that that will have a budgetary implication on it, because if we significantly increase the amount, we want to make sure that additional funds are budgeted. Also include the concept of reserving a certain percentage for a point during the year, so that community groups or clubs that go to a tournament when they apply, the funds are not fully exhausted. What we articulated was with the additional funds, we don't think that we would have that challenge, but we would observe it over the next course of the year, but also provide staff with the ability to reserve funds. So if we see we're actually running out, we may take a step to reserve funds. And so we can work through the wording on that. Additionally, through the annual budget process, roll over additional monies that were allocated from the budget so that they're retained in the program so that a balance could accumulate for the program. Direct staff to propose a term to limit the amount of time a grantee could be suspended for violating any of the prohibited activity. Include information on the city's website about the grant as well as a post-event recap, small. I think there was a suggestion of 500 words or less. Advertise broadly, and that's it.
So can I have a motion with those additions to the staff recommendation? Basically?
We had a question. Did we want to put anything in there about repeats? And then my question is that what you're putting in here is not specifics, like you don't have, you just say a term for limit of suspension. Did you want us to put a number in there, like 4 years or?
If the committee has direction, we will certainly take it. What I was recommending is direction that the committee would provide to staff to incorporate a limit when we bring it to the city council. And I was doing that because I think we want to talk among staff around, is it 2 years? Is it 1 year? Is it 4? But if the committee has a desire, we're certainly ready to take that feedback.
It could even vary potentially depending upon the seriousness of the violation. So I think the thought is to give us some opportunity to think that through, but include clearly a provision like that.
Okay, it wasn't clear to me. I'm happy to make a motion. I just didn't know how specific I wanted to get in terms of numbers, like increasing. And there was another concept in there, like the grants are 10,000 max right now. And we want to increase those to account for inflation, but we also want to increase the total grant size year by year so we don't reduce the number of grantees. But you had mentioned that you wanted to increase the total grant size based on the total budget of the city. So that wasn't exactly clear to me.
Yeah.
How that would work.
Good clarification. Did not mean to convey that we would increase the grant size based on the total budget of the city. What I conveyed is if we do increase the grant amount, ideally, we should increase that $90,000 that comes from the general fund so that we're not reducing the number of people that could get a grant. However, this committee nor the city council can't take an action to increase that budget because that needs to be made annually by the city council. And so I was just offering that certainly based on the committee direction, staff would take it back and build in a process to increase the amount on a periodic basis. Maybe it's annually, maybe it's every 2 years. But we would know that around budget time, we would need to factor that in and include that in our proposal to the city council.
Just want to have a comment about reapplication or of grantees that have lost their grant status because of whatever reason. I'm a big proponent of make policy what you want, which is at some point we want to make sure that the people, that is not just time that has passed, but that there's been some changes or there is some promise that these things will not happen again. So maybe there is a reapplication process that's different, that is a little bit more, harder for people who have done things in the past and not limited just to time. Maybe something bad happened because of a particular bad circumstance, but they've addressed that rather quickly. And maybe there is a cool off period of a year, but then after that, it doesn't take 4 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years before something happens. They say, here's an audit that we've done. Here are the policy changes. Here are the process changes that we've made. This is why it won't happen again. This is what, I would, maybe if we can think along terms of how people get back into good graces, not just a time period.
I agree with that. Like what corrective action organization is taking basically. If the staff is satisfied with that, oh yeah, they did try their best and they did take checks and balances to fix this problem, the time period can be reduced or increased depending on that. Yeah.
Certainly, I think that can happen right. I know that can happen right now based on our, the current proposal. So if Y Club is suspended for, let's say, 2 years, in year 3, if they want to apply, they will apply, but certainly staff will look at the reason why they were suspended, ask follow-up questions, and if we're not satisfied that they've rectified it, that will factor into whether.
Understood. I just want to make that very clear because the only things that I had heard were discussions about timing and things like that. So I think that there should be a cool down period. I'm not going to tell you what that cool down period is. But I, just want to make very clear that it's not just time, which allows people to reapply. Thank you.
I'm sorry. We've talked a few times about limiting repeat awards. And so I just want to make sure that we have clarity on what the committee desires for that. So we do know that, yes, there are groups that have received a grant 1 year after the other, right? We know that. We know that members on the committee have said, hey, it might be nice to limit so that the same people aren't getting the grants every year. Staff has articulated that while some groups have received grants every year, that has not allowed other people not to receive grants because we have not fully expended the funds. And so we might, and hopefully we frankly will hit a point where we have more applicants in the pool. And so the current process allows staff to make determinations on who gets a grant for various reasons. I also think it's important to say that people apply for grants throughout the year. It's not a set application deadline. And so prohibiting someone from applying for a grant, if we have a prohibition of repeat awardees, let's say someone applies in January and our rule says you can't receive a grant 2 or 3 years in a row, we say, you know what, that's a hard rule. We would need to have that as the criteria, as you cannot because you received it last year or 2 years in a row, not really because we want to reserve funds, because what that group will say is, hey, I'm applying in January because my event is in February, right? And by the time toward the end of the year, if you have money left over, it's no good to me because I was applying for my event in February. And so if we are going to prohibit groups from receiving a grant for multiple years, it's really going to need to be an explicit prohibition. And we may want to do some further thought on is it 1 year, is it 2 years, or is it based on estimated usage of funds in the grant cycle? So just want to make sure we get clarity from the committee on your desire.
I do have input on that. I think right now we have a situation, it sounds like, where we do have grantees that are granted every year because we don't have necessarily more applicants than we have money. But I think we really need to think about the situation where we have many more applicants than we have money. And if we think in those terms, and we think about a democratic way of giving the money, which is how do we affect the most number of organizations, across time, I think that would kind of work itself out. But that kind of tells me 2 things. The first thing is we need to get information about this grant. We need to advertise these grants a little bit more so that we're not in the situation of, well, we're giving the money to the same people because they're the only people applying. That's the first issue. The second issue is we need to think about the time where we do have more applicants than we have money. And we need to think of a fair process for that. And once we have a fair process for that, we need to find a way to create that situation.
I think what staff got the idea, and what I'm saying is, why don't we wait for a year, or as I think Michelle mentioned, we can wait for next year, how it goes. If the funds are still left after our advertising and getting back to the community, still left, it doesn't make sense to stop them for that matter. But we can revisit this thing, I would say, next 2 years, and then we can decide about it. For the time being, we can continue it.
Okay, I'm happy to make a motion. So I move that we approve the staff's recommendation for the changes as outlined in the presentation with the following proposals. One is that we would increase the grant amounts to account for inflation in a method to be determined by staff, and then also to increase the total amount of the program to compensate for that, but that would be approved by the council in a budget process. The second would be to somehow reserve a portion of the money for later in the year to account for last minute tournament type events. This third is to roll over the balances for the from the program to the following year. Or to consider a term limit for suspension that would be based on the severity of the infraction, as well as some sort of organizational change that rectifies the method by which the infraction occurred. And then to require organizations after an event to submit a no more than 500-word description of how their event went, and that would be included on the city's website.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Staff is clear, right?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Okay, so our next item is review, item number 3, 24-628, review meeting management protocol options and Rosenberg's rules of order, and provide staff direction to staff. Staff, I think, seated on England.
Very good. Maria, are you getting that up? Thank you. Today, we are presenting to you really some information that you requested regarding some meeting management protocols, including some additional details on Rosenberg's rules of order and other possible modifications you might consider in developing a formal kind of meeting management structure. We are not going to be creating that policy today. It really is, today's meeting is for purposes of soliciting kind of your input on a change to a more Rosenberg's oriented meeting management protocol approach, and some other kind of details and considerations that we're seeking your input on. So first slide, as a matter of background, you will recall, I was not here back on August 17th, 2021, at a council priority setting session. The council actually approved a 6-month pilot program for some basic meeting management protocols. The idea was that would be revisited at the 2022 council priority session, but you did not have a 2022 council priority session, nor did you ever really take action, because I don't think it was ultimately presented to you with a resolution formalizing, what you actually did at your priority setting session. Since then, I think there's been some pretty substantial compliance with the concepts in that meeting management protocol, but really right now, other than the applicability of Robert's Rules of Order, you do not have a formal kind of meeting management structure and protocol system. Back in December, I was here for that. The committee provided input on the current procedures and considered some possible modifications, including the possibility of switching to a more Rosenberg's oriented, structure away from Robert's rules. But there was a request from it for some additional information about the Rosenberg's model and a desire, I think, for all of you to take a closer look at that because it was distributed, to you for you to be able to evaluate whether that made sense or not. Next slide. Today's objective, again, is to present some additional information to you on Rosenberg's, to receive your input on Roberts versus Rosenberg's and whether you're comfortable with making that switch, to receive committee input on other key elements of meeting management protocols that we'll present to you, and to gather enough information in order for us to put together a actual formal curated policy for you to consider at your September meeting, hopefully in a sufficient state of doneness at that time so that it could then be taken up to the city council for their consideration. So next slide, please. What's wrong with Robert's Rules of Order? My answer to that is there's nothing really wrong with it. It's not particularly suitable for small legislative bodies, and it's really been used for decades as kind of the default meeting management, structure and rule system by a lot of government agencies. And I'll say still the primary probably reference source for most cities and counties operating within the state of California. But what's wrong with it is it's just too much. It was a really kind of a paramilitary set of rules established in 1876 by an army officer who was fancying, massive organizations with a lot of complicated actions, taken over time. The rules themselves have evolved, over time. This is the 11th, edition that I'm showing you here. And it's voluminous, as you can see. A lot of it is complicated with a lot of technical provisions that don't really even apply, to legislative bodies, and certainly not to smaller legislative bodies. And it can make the rules unwieldy, sometimes confusing, and because there's so many rules, potential traps, for the unwary. If there's some technical rule that you're not, complying with, that may create issues or concerns with folks. The thing I've also noted in my conversations with folks, and it was also my experience down in Chula Vista, where we had Robert's Rules as our default set of procedures, although we had an elaborate set of procedures that overlaid on those. A lot of organizations that say they use Robert's really don't, right? Patterns and practices evolve over time. You create your own local policies. I've observed that even here with your patterns and practices. It's not a strict Robert's Rules of Order procedures. It's kind of a default, reference point. And so even ones who say they use Robert's in a lot of respects have moved away, from Robert's. You've got the next slide up there. Thank you. By comparison, Rosenberg's is a simplified set, much simplified set of parliamentary rules that is in fact being used by a growing number of cities, hardly the majority, in and around California. I know at least up here, nearby locally, Cupertino uses Rosenberg's as their primary reference point. So does Santa Rosa. Other cities don't. Palo Alto, San Jose, others still refer to Robert's. But again, I would suggest not a pure, Robert's, because it really doesn't lend itself to that. So Rosenberg's is more compressed. You've got a copy of it. You've had a copy of it a couple of times now. It's seven pages, not 600, plus, pages. And it's also has the benefit of being more aligned with Brown Act requirements. It's not exactly right. There's some things that we need to do, as your city clerk knows, that are different. Rosenberg's doesn't answer all those questions, but it's much more aligned to the kind of general rules, and standards that we all need to comply with, regardless of what our local rules say. It retains the basic tenets of order, but again, in a more practical, user-friendly manner. These basic tenets are: there is a presiding officer, right, who has a lot of authority and receives deference, right, on how the meetings, are managed. There's a motion, there's a second, right? There's a vote, there's voting requirements and abstention requirements, and a series of detailed motions that are in your RTC that I'll touch on a little bit in my presentation. It's all very recognizable. This is not a strange, concept. And in effect, I think we've been doing a lot of those things already. Another benefit of Rosenberg's, aside from the fact that it's more compressed, is that it really doesn't, it's not a dramatic change from how you've been operating, already. It just really is more accessible. Next slide, please. There are some differences and some things that are the same that I'll go through in these next couple of slides. The quorum rules are essentially the same as what Roberts requires. The process for agenda item consideration is generally the same. Rosenberg's has a little better narrative about how that's described. The time periods for the time that members of the public and I'm sorry, members of the legislative body can speak are really substantially the same. It's deferred to the presiding officer in order to manage that with some flexibility on how he or she manages that, but that's subject to overrule by the majority, as most of these rules are. And so both Roberts and Rosenberg's sets out a presiding officer dominant structure, but subject to overrule, by the majority on points of order and on other matters. Again, the actions to approve are similar. There's a motion, there's a second, there's a vote process, really substantially the same. One of the simplifying features I like of Roberts, and please don't ever do this to me if I'm assisting with meeting management, on next slide, please, is the number of multiple motions that may be in consideration at one time. In fact, Roberts allows up to 13 simultaneous motions to be considered at one time. That would be quite a circus act. And I would endeavor, of course, to keep all those straight for you, but I don't want to. Rosenberg's has a much more manageable 3 possible motions, in play at any one time. That's really not ideal either, to be honest. It's good to take them up, sequentially and one at a time. But Rosenberg's, again, an evidence of how it has more practical application and use. Substitute motions. Under Roberts, these changes really are more, the differences are really more technical than anything else. Roberts is more technical. One thing that Rosenberg's good at is allows a member to propose a completely different motion as a substitute motion and gives the chair discretion as to how to characterize that motion. This is actually how we operate now, pretty much. As you all know, there's a friendly amendment, right, that you can make to the motion maker and to the second if there's a second already. There's an amendment, to a motion that you can propose in a formal way, right? If the friendly amendment is accepted, you could propose to amend a motion. Or there is a substitute motion. Our substitute motions sometimes are amendments, sometimes they're completely, new motions. There's mechanisms for handling that under both Roberts and Rosenberg's. Rosenberg's is a little more, straightforward. And again, ultimately, it's left to the chair to manage kind of and distinguish between, what's being proposed. Next slide, please. The motion to reconsider is also similar under both Roberts and Rosenberg's. I won't go into the technical differences because you have your own local policy, 042, right, on motions to reconsider. And it's definitely something we will all need to consider as we're going down this path. There are a number of rules that you have made that are different than Roberts, right? That are different than Rosenberg's. Which of those do we want to keep? Which of those do we want to incorporate? What do you want to do with those? We're not going to answer all those questions, right now. In theory, you could adopt a new set of meeting management protocols with whatever you want at the center of it. Say it's Rosenberg's. And that policy, if it's a good policy, would refer to other related policies and procedures as part of the overall corpus, if you will, of all your meeting management protocols. So you always will have the right to make local rules here, and a motion to reconsider is an example of where you've done that. Courtesy and decorum rules. There's really a little more of this under Rosenberg's, where it talks about that. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later when we get into the request for your input on things you might want to change. One meaningful change between Rosenberg's and Roberts is under Rosenberg's with respect to interruptions. And I'm sorry, with respect to the ability to withdraw a motion. Rosenberg's allows a person who's made the motion, even if it's seconded, to withdraw that motion. That's kind of what we do now, right? As a matter of our informal application. Technically, Roberts doesn't allow that. Roberts says when you make a motion and it's a second, it's no longer the motion maker or the second's, ability to manipulate that. It's really now a motion and a second that is the property of the body itself. And in order to allow a withdrawal of that motion before a vote, technically the larger body would need to vote on that. Rosenberg's is more practical, and more reasonable. If someone's making a motion and they're hearing what the deliberations are and they don't support their own motion any longer, Rosenberg's allows, I think appropriately, the ability of that person to withdraw their motion. There are some additional differences and benefits, I think, of Rosenberg's that I've not listed on this slide that I'll go over quickly. There are elements of a procedure that allow certain things to happen with a 2/3 vote, right? A supermajority vote of the council. For example, a motion to limit the debate, either to call the question or to limit, the amount of time is contemplated by Rosenberg, but it requires a 2/3 vote, of the group. If in fact you're dealing with nominations for positions, for example, on a board or commission or to a subcommittee, there's a 2/3 vote provision under Rosenberg's to close those nominations. There's an ability to suspend the rules and actually waive rules that would otherwise be applied by a 2/3 supermajority vote, and some other 2/3 vote elements that are included in Rosenberg's. Again, as you're thinking about this, you're not choosing Roberts or Rosenberg's per se, right? You're choosing, in my sense of this, kind of a starting place. And you can, as part of your development of these rules, modify those rules, as you see fit. For me, Rosenberg's in a more compact, form that more aligns with the kind of things we do already is a better starting place. So I'll go to the next slide, please. Now, in talking about current meeting management practices, this is really the structure that was contemplated out of your priority setting session back in 2021, and is more or less with a little tweaker here that I'll identify what you do now, right? City staff provides a report on the item when an agenda item comes in front of you, if they have one. Each council member then is given the opportunity to ask questions. The city staff will then, to the extent possible, provide a response to all those questions. Then the public has an opportunity to provide public comments on the item. That mayor's request, city staff shall, to the extent possible, provide responses to comments or questions, provided by the public. And then then a council member, after that portion of the item is done, shall make a motion, and the motion should be seconded by another council person. At that point, then each council member who wishes to speak to the motion can deliberate, it can make their comments, and the council deliberates on the motion and then ultimately votes. The thing that, and item 6, kind of the motion and the second as a trigger point for deliberations, is what Roberts contemplates, and it's actually what Rosenberg's contemplates. It has not been your pattern in practice to do that all the time, and it's not been a pattern in practice that I've observed in other places where I've been. You could be strict about that and require that. But for reasons we'll talk about in a little bit, there is some value, particularly where an item's not a simple item, for people to speak their mind first, right? And communicate what they might be thinking about an item. What's moved and what's seconded isn't necessarily obvious from staff's presentation, from what you hear from the public. You may need to know more, you may need to deliberate more in order for an appropriate, motion and second even to be made. So we'll talk about that. That's your current meeting management practice in rough outline. Next slide. There's a number of different things for you to kind of consider, and we're going to take up each of these in order. They're kind of outlined here on this groovy chart we have. But next slide. One of the things that we talked about and you debated at least preliminarily last time was, does it make sense to actually impose time limits on council members who are making comments as part of the deliberations? There's some pros and cons to that, right? It could help focus remarks, right? If you only have so much time, and ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to speak within a reasonable total time for the item to be considered. On the other hand, specific time limits or limits on the number of times, right, someone may be able to speak is kind of an artificial limit depending upon the nature of the item, and it might negatively impact council deliberations and a dynamic information idea sharing process on an important policy matters. So there's pros and cons to this, right? Another practical challenge of actually limiting the times that each of you would be allowed to speak, or limiting the number of times that you speak. Who keeps track of that? How do you keep track of that? And is there really a practical, logical process for that? I bet the city clerk doesn't want to do it. She'd be the logical person who would have to, but keeping in effect a chess turn, a clock, on folks to see if they're exceeding their time limits does present some practical, difficulties, and could be challenging to staff. The alternative to that, and really what I think is what most jurisdictions follow, is just continuing to rely on the presiding officer and their deference of authority to guide city council's discussions in a timely manner. And depending upon, the dynamics of the conversation, how late it is, right? How many people have spoken already, those things can be managed by the presiding officer. Again, subject to overrule, by a majority of the council, should that decision be made. So you can have thoughts about time limits. There's pros and cons. We talked about that before, and I wanted to present it again. Next slide. If in fact you do propose time limits, there could be some accommodation made to allow for more extended comments. A person who's come up against their time limit could ask the chair for extended comments or for an extension of their time period in order to allow them to complete their time. Next slide. This is one we talked about, again, as a typical standard requirement and contemplated by both Roberts and Rosenberg's, but not necessarily, in my view, a best practice or even the practice of this council. We could provide and build into that set of protocols I outlined for you in the first place, a formal provision for discussions prior to making a motion, right? Right now, it's really just done as a matter of practice. If you all value that, you could include in there some requirement, for example, that the presiding officer, before they receive any motion or allow, any second, say, hey, before we do have a motion or second, do folks want to have, at least some level of comment and, an input on the item? You could formalize that. And again, the presiding officer would typically manage that. Next slide. Other options to consider, formalizing that aren't formalized now, but are a matter of pattern and practice, is addressing the chair. Council members should address their comments to the chair as the presiding officer and not directly to other members or to the public to assist with maintaining order and civility. There could be a provision that suggests that council participating in deliberations minimize repeating points. Council members should avoid, for example, as this states, extended restatements of points already made by others to keep the discussions efficient. The chair, again, would preside over these matters and may endeavor to minimize repeated remarks. There could be explicit provisions that require focus on the agenda item itself, right? To formalize generally a best practice, right? And also ultimately a requirement of the Brown Act, right? That discussions be focused on the matter at hand, that comments relate directly to the agenda item being discussed. Again, a number of these things are actually reflected as guidelines in Rosenberg's, although not formal policies, overseen by the presiding officer. Next slide. Other things that we had talked about in the previous presentation of this is formalizing requirements for respectful language. There's also provisions for this in Rosenberg's, but you could develop a rule either based on Rosenberg's or maybe more appropriately based on your existing Santa Clara Code of Ethics and Behavioral Standards that council members be required to be respectful and policy oriented with no personal attacks, questioning of motives, or other forms of disrespectful comments, consistent with City of Santa Clara Code of Ethics. And if you look in the elaborate list of Code of Ethics, all these concepts are there, right? If you're going to develop a meeting management protocol, those rules are there and they guide you, but it might be good to have it all in one place, right? And be explicit and identified, in fact, as an explicit protocol. Concept of no interruptions, allow each member to speak without, being interrupted, could also be something that you could formalize. And then in terms of enforcement, the typical standard is the chair of the meeting as the presiding officer could raise points themselves to address violation of meeting rules. Individual members may as well also raise, points of order in the process. Ultimately, there are, and Rosenberg contemplates, this, a right of someone to call for a point of order and to appeal preliminary determinations by the presiding officer with respect to one of these matters. And if an appeal is made and that is seconded, then a majority of you will then vote on, whether or not a determination made by the presiding officer, in fact, will rule the day in how you might proceed on a particular matter. Next slide, please. Before I go to next steps, there was a request at the previous meeting to talk a little bit about the public comment provision on the agenda and to do some, we offered to do some benchmarking with that and come back with that information. We've done that. Sorry, I don't have it as a slide here. I'm just distributing it to all of you. We've looked at a number of the area cities, including not an area city, but my former city and city manager's former city on how they handle the public comment portion of the agenda. Milpitas has the public, we call it public presentations, but a lot of them call it public comment. Milpitas has that at the beginning of the agenda after the ceremonial items, but before consent, in general business. They don't have any particular time limits or structure on that. It's all managed by the presiding officer. Mountain View places their public comments roughly in the middle of the agenda after consent, but before, general business. Again, no time limits are provided there other than individual time limits, right? They don't limit the total amount of time, that dedicated to public comments. There are definitely individual speaker limits in each case. Palo Alto has theirs actually at the beginning of the agenda, right after closed session and before consent in general business. And they actually impose a 30-minute total public comment, time limit on that with, if there's anything left over, they trail that to the end of the agenda. I think that's what VTA does too, Member Jane. San Jose actually has public comments as their last item on the agenda, before adjournment. That being said, they do start at 1 o'clock and they sometimes do adjust that. If they break for dinner, they might actually allow public comment before they break for dinner. So that's a basic tenet, right? But that's adjusted. Sunnyvale has it at the beginning of the agenda, after ceremonial items and before general business. They actually have this as a 15-minute, cap. I'm not sure what the individual speaker limits are, but that may be extended or continued by the mayor, depending upon the circumstances. In Chula Vista, the public presentations is at the middle of the agenda, after the consent and before general business. This was not the case while I was there, but they have since adopted a kind of a 21-minute limit. Concept is that there's 7 speakers, right? And they're limited to 3-minute a piece. The mayor can adjust that, depending upon circumstances. If there's 8 speakers, right, and it's 24 minutes, I would imagine they wouldn't make that person wait to the end. But again, similar to what is done at Palo Alto and at VTA, if they don't get it done, within that 21 roughly minute period of time, the rest of it is trailed to the end of the agenda. And San Bruno, fairly typically beginning of the agenda, after the pledge, but before ceremonial and consent in general business. Actually, that's a little atypical to have it right up front like that. So different folks approach it different ways, right? And you could certainly approach it in a different way. Our current approach, as you know, is that it appears after the consent, agenda, with each individual getting a 3-minute opportunity to present. There's no actual time limit, but the presiding officer does have discretion, right? Depending upon how full the rest of the agenda is and how many folks are there to speak, to limit, to actually reduce the amount of time that individual speakers might have, and or to put a limit on how many people are going to speak before we get to general business. So right now we do it, and I think this is probably most typical in other jurisdictions, in a way that gives the presiding officer, some discretion, again, with input and potential ability to overrule, by the majority on how to handle public presentations. I wanted to give you that information, but I don't necessarily want you to include that in your meeting management policy. I view that as a little bit different of an item. That's really more agenda management as opposed to kind of managing, agenda items, within themselves. And so it's certainly something you could take up, but I don't necessarily see it as being part of a meeting management, protocol. So next steps for you are to tell me what you think about, Rosenberg's as a potential, core model upon which you would base, some of your meeting management protocol rules and policies, and any of the other different issues that were presented to you in this presentation, or anything else you might want, to include as a rule or policy. Once we receive, that input, again, the concept would be we would look to develop a Santa Clara tailored policy. It might be, and I haven't decided what to recommend to you yet, in theory, you don't have to say we adopt Rosenberg's. You could say, hey, develop me a policy based on Rosenberg's, but with the following changes. So it would all be in one place, as opposed to having to look a variety of different, places for your rules and policies. And then to the extent your rule or policy doesn't deal with everything necessarily that could come up, you could then identify Rosenberg's as the default. To the extent our policy doesn't deal with this, we'll defer to Rosenberg's kind of as the default rulemaking procedure. So that's what I have for you in terms of presenting information. Prepared to answer your questions and obviously receive your direction as you deem appropriate. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, City Attorney. I appreciate that. I think we are trying to solve a problem of multiple years in span of a half an hour or something, but we'll try our best. Yeah. Committee members. Suggestions? Please.
So I don't believe the city actually adopted Robert's rules. I think that Robert's rules comes up because it's a well-known rule system, and I don't think that there's any formal adoption of that. I think that when people There is.
Actually is. Yeah,
Okay,
Robert's
well then-
rules is what we refer to as our default rules procedure in our ordinance.
Understood. And my complaint as a resident and as a council member has been, it's not about the rule system that's applied. It's actually about consistency. There's no consistency and there's no enforcement. I've often noted that previously, and in places like the Planning Commission, you do have city attorney staff coming in saying, well, this is my recommendation. I understand that a commission is very different from a council, elected council. But at the same time, I feel that the parliamentarian or somebody that's coming in can talk about policy and give rule input without the ability to enforce. I think that the input is always possible and always should be available. One of the problems that I see is that we've had people simply say, that's not what I want to do. That's not what my role is. That's not something that should be done. But I think that the people who know most about the rules, the people who are most concerned about the city facing legal issues or other issues should in fact be the ones to give input. Again, it's not about enforcement. We're not even getting to the point of enforcement, but give input on what the rules are and potentially what recommendations should be. I feel that respectful language and behavior often gets ignored, and especially with our current process. Our current process goes against the very thing we talk about at the beginning of every meeting, which is robust discussion. Oftentimes, I refrain from asking questions because I want to hear the answers to questions that have already been asked. With the current process of you have to ask one round of questions, you have to ask every question that you have, wait for results, and then you get one more round, that doesn't work. I think it actually kills robust discussion. I find myself often waiting, and I don't often ask questions the first time because I'm waiting for answers from the first round of questions. With the current process, I have to second guess every possible response from staff and then say, well, if the answer is A, then I have this further question. And if the answer is B, I have these further questions. If the answer is C, and that doesn't work. Again, the city council was for robust discussion. It was not for efficiency. We'd like things to take a lot less time. We would like our children to behave. We would like a lot of things, but we have to deal with what are we trying to accomplish? And what we're trying to accomplish is we need robust discussion. I hear things about limiting time. I hear limiting things. I think, well, I understand trying to control time or trying to manage time, so to say. Nobody can control time. But the things that limit democracy, I mean, even as a resident, we need to realize that we're not going to be on council forever. We will be residents again someday, and we may have to be in the audience and have to give input as a resident. And a lot of times, the residents come here and their time is limited. Well, because of the number of people, we're limiting your time to 1 minute. I think that's happened in Milpitas as well. Right. But we need to realize and remember that this is often, sometimes, the only time and often the last time that residents get to speak on an issue that affects them personally or affects their community in a major way. And to limit it because we want an efficient meeting doesn't seem like it's the best thing for democracy. I understand it's good for efficient meetings and time management, but we also need to realize what the purpose of the meetings are for. I have the question on how Rosenberg's is more aligned with the Brown Act. Like, I don't understand how it's more aligned. I do hear some of the benefits, how it's simplified, how it's a little bit more streamlined. Right, again, time limits, not a fan. If you want to reduce repetition, that could be something. But, I think about a lot of times where I'm accused of, for example, this isn't relevant to discussion. Well, it is relevant. Sometimes we have to differentiate between things that are irrelevant, things that provide background information. And if that isn't going to be allowed, or if that isn't going to be considered, or we don't have a good process to consider that, I'm worried that people will strike information as redundant or irrelevant without having a chance. I think that people should say, well, this is what I'm trying to establish. Again, if we don't have robust discussion, it reduces the point of the council meetings. And talking to the motion, I'd really like if we said, okay, now that we've had input Now we've had a motion on the table. The conversation should be to the motion. The problem with that is the way that our current process works, and we only have a couple of chances to speak. We often break that process because the process does not encourage robust discussion. But because there's only a certain number of times to speak, I often find myself, and I see other people, being missed or overlooked for input. And now I have to talk about my input when a motion's already been made, because I don't know that the first thing out of somebody's mouth is going to be, I'd like to make a motion, right? At some point, it would be really nice if people said, well, people have given the input, now I'm waiting for a motion. But I don't necessarily want to stop committee members or council members from doing that either. And again, public comment benchmarking, I just want consistency and across commissions as well, at least for this city. I'm less concerned with what other cities do. I am concerned with people have gone to planning commission meetings and they've had an idea of when public comment is in a planning commission meeting. Then they come to city council and they've missed it because we do it differently. I believe in planning commissions at the end of the meeting, and here they come and it's like they've missed it. So I want some consistency because most of the time people have gone to 5 or 6 planning commission meetings, maybe 2 or 3, but they only come to one city council meeting, and the process being different, they've lost their chance to give input. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Committee Member Jen.
I'm a huge fan of splitting the public comment period. I think that we often end up voting on things when everyone is very tired and I don't have the stamina of Councilmember Park. But
I don't even have this time.
so I like the way that VTA does it by splitting it, and it seems like there's precedents that other cities do it the same way. And I do actually like the idea of doing it before consent, because that's when we have the most people there, and they're there often for accommodations and whatever. And so maybe before they leave, there's a public comment period. I like efficient meetings. I don't like them to be drawn out. I'm kind of a fan of our current way of doing questions, but the pilot was only 1 round of questions, which I don't agree with. And we've actually devolved from that to have a 2nd round of questions, but that's not what was in the pilot program. So we need to formalize that. I don't really understand how you could have 13 motions on the floor. But I don't even understand how we could have 3. There's a motion, and then there's maybe an amendment, and then there's a substitute motion. But it seems like the original motion is superseded by the amendment, so there's only 2. But anyway, I don't understand how Robert's rules says that the body owns the motion after it's made, because when you have an amendment, it's still the maker of the motion that has to approve the amendment. So anyway, it's a fine point that I don't understand. The thing that I don't really get is that if we put into policies like avoid repeating or address the chair and not the other members, doesn't seem to me any enforcement. I mean, are we talking about, censures or admonishments if that happens? I'm not a fan of those. Also, respectful language. What is the consequences of that? I mean, I have been accused at one meeting of having somebody write my comments for me. And that was a case where, is that when we say address the chair and not the other members, in that case, I would have to address the member that made that accusation. So I'm a little unclear about how these things would be enforced.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Committee Member Jain. So I'll also recap some of this. Like, first thing, if we move to Rosenberg, I know it's very concise, but does this cover the ambiguities? I think the Robert Rule are more like that thick book, because they might be covering all the ambiguities, and this happens in this situation, this happens in this situation. So how does Rosenberg explain those ambiguities? Like, if that happens, okay, how clear it is to follow Rosenberg? I know it's more simplified version, but I want to find out, in case of any ambiguity, what will be the result of solution for that. City Attorney, you did mention that Rosenberg has some 2/3 voting for, you took example of the commission appointments or something. If we move to Rosenberg, can we make our own policy decision that, okay, Rosenberg said 2/3, but we will not follow. We will have our own rules. 2/3 will be followed only on this particular, to make it more clear, basically. Discussion before motion, that is really good presentation, and even in the staff report, it was mentioned. I would highly recommend that no motion should be made unless we finish a discussion part of it. Sometimes the motion comes right after the agenda item is presented. Here's the motion. Like, it defeats the whole purpose of the public presentation and defeats the purpose of people who are watching the meeting, basically. So I think this should be a clear guideline from the chair that, hey, this is a time for the discussion of the item. And once the discussion part is over, then we'll go back to the motion, basically. Question, I know the current system we are following, there are good and bad things on that. The bad thing I will consider is the follow-up questions. Like, I think when we hear a question, let's say I pose a question to staff on a particular presentation, right? And when I'm getting the answer, I have a follow-up question right there and then. So at least it should be changed that the person who asked the question, he can pose a counter secondary question to that. It should not be that, oh, you asked the question, now keep shut and nothing doing. That defeats the healthy discussion part of it. So a counter question during the answer session should be, and that should not only for me who posed that particular question at the outset, but even any other council member who has a relevant counter question on that should be allowed to ask a counter question right there and then, because it defeats the purpose of discussion for that matter. So that is the one. You brought, I think it is in your presentation also, no personal attacks. So that is something which is bothersome to all of us, basically. Personal attacks comes and then somebody has to rebut it. Now, is the person who is rebutting it is bad than the person who is making a personal attack? How we solve that problem? Like, who monitors that and how we solve that problem? That's my one of the things I'm trying to solve. If somebody is making a personal attack, when he or she should be stopped, and if a personal attack has been made against somebody, when can they rebut? But because if the attack is made and you are not giving opportunity for other person to rebut, the attack stands basically. So how we handle that, that's the one thing I would propose to city attorney, how we can handle that. Limiting the time, I know I'm in favor of not having a diversion from the agenda, but some council member may have a much more in-depth knowledge about an agenda item. So if we limit that time for anybody, it restricts them to present, give a public output basically, because we don't have a much more presence in the council chambers, but the discussion part, whenever we are talking about it, that makes more important for people who can watch the meeting later on that, hey, yeah, this question was asked and he presented very well. He presented the facts about this thing, which can be looked into. So that's my idea about it. With that, I would ask the staff to sum it up and see where we are heading to.
There were some questions there and some comments that I'll respond to. I'll start from the beginning. Member Park, I understand you're clearly talking directly to me with your first point. You're looking for a more active city attorney and parliamentarian with respect to the city council, and I appreciate that.
I don't care who does it. I just like it to be done. It just seems like it would be, right.
Yeah, no, I understand. And that is a very atypical, role of the city attorney, and one you and I've talked about, a fair amount that I don't embrace and think is appropriate. I do appreciate your observations of the Planning Commission, very different body. And I think that a lot of what you're observing at the Planning Commission is assistance, and I've talked with my lawyer about this, on how they actually make motions and take actions on the things that they're taking. Both the city manager and I are very active in that with you when you're looking for some, assistance, or there's legal parameters, that need to be managed and guided. I think the Planning Commission might be a little needier, than all of you, as experienced as they all are in designing, how an action and decision is made. Different lawyers have different styles. That could be part of what you're observing as well, but maybe you and I could sit and watch a Planning Commission meeting together and you can give me some examples of that, because I can learn from all sorts of people, including as an experienced lawyer, although not as experienced as me, as I have staffing Planning Commission in terms of how he approaches those things. But I think those are more legal, structural, how do we get there from here types of, questions, as opposed to parliamentarian, types of questions. The respectful language concept that you've talked about is definitely a challenging one, and I'll get to that at the end. I've heard from you regarding questions, and from a number of you regarding questions, that maybe there's some appetite for treating that differently. I didn't actually see in the protocols that were not really formally adopted a limit on a round of questions, for that. That certainly hasn't been what I've observed in terms of how the presiding officer oversees that. It might not always be supportive and exuberant about multiple rounds of questions, and how she approaches that. But I've seen multiple rounds of questions, allowed, and so I think that is currently addressed, but or at least managed, by the presiding officer in her discretion, which different people can apply differently. But there is no actual rule now on how questions are going to be asked, how many rounds can be asked, whether follow-up questions, are appropriate. And if that's something that this group wants some more articulation of, what the meeting management protocols would be, that's certainly a rule, that can be developed. Mr. Chair, I think Mr. Member Park wants to make a comment to me.
Yeah, I want to clarify, just to clarify.
Yeah.
Which is, I think that Chair Chahal did state it well in his last comment, which was, it's not necessarily about like how many times we can, rounds of questions, but it is about if a person has a question we have to wait until all our questions are asked before we can get an answer to that question. It's how the answers are given. And that the way that the answers are given constitutes the rounds of questioning. And that's very disruptive to my way of thinking,
No,
because I'm used to asking a question. I just want to know, did you mean this? You mean that? And then the chair says, well, let's hold the answers until the end. I need the answer to that now because I have several questions that are being queued based on the answer to that question. And I often have to hold those questions.
Yep.
Oftentimes, so it's not about limiting how many times we have rounds of questions, but it is about changing the way that we do these rounds. They shouldn't be rounds. There should be some robust discussion, even within one council members or one committee members, questions or comments to staff.
I heard that and understood that. And again, if two or more of you want, that to be built into the policy regarding how questions are managed in that regard, you can propose that and I'll come back and I'll draft that and that can go up to the city council.
And the only difference is, my understanding is there is no policy which mandates that. There is no policy that we have to follow that says.
There isn't
that's
currently.
correct.
And
so-
that's what you would be creating.
And the only reason that we're doing that is because the chair suggested and because staff has told us this is practice and council seems to accept it. And I think that is what I'd like to make very clear. There is no requirement to follow. In fact, any requirement expired some time ago. And at this point, we should not consider changing that process. We should be considering how do we get the most robust discussion. And if we're going to try to make this efficient, let's try to make this efficient by doing things, limiting repetition, doing other things, but not by trying to control how many times we give input or how the answer should be given.
So if I can paraphrase, I think what we are trying is we saw the implementation of what we decided in 2021, whatever the time frame was. We are trying to make it more interactive and trying to make it more robust discussion, whether it's a counter question during that question answer session. So we want to incorporate that.
I hear you.
And as you rightly mentioned, we don't have a policy right now. That policy already expired, so we are clear about it.
I'm hearing you 100%. I hope the way I'm going through these don't suggest I'm not hearing you. I am saying that if you wanted to build a policy around the question process, there isn't one now. And that could be very much part of something that you develop and that is ultimately proposed to council.
Perfect.
Going through another one of the points made by Member Park initially, and I think mirrored by others, I'm sensing a consensus kind of position that you like the idea of there being at least some opportunity for discussion before a motion, is made, and that in a second, as that lends itself, to more informed kind of deliberations and ultimately potentially a more informed kind of motion and second based on that input. So I heard Member Park, you say that. I heard you not being supportive of a certain number of times to speak or time limits on speaking. Again, I'm not proposing either of those things. I'm identifying those as things different people have talked about at different times. There's clearly a balancing, right, between focus and efficiency and full opportunity to speak. It's you guys that will decide how you want that to translate into a policy. And that's what I'll draft, and present, to the city council. So Member Park heard you loud and clear on that. And I think there's consensus from your fellow members on that point. Member Park, I think those were your kind of questions and points. Member Jane, you talk about you commented on the public comment period, that you like it, the concept of it potentially being split and that it being maybe even as soon as before consent. Again, that could be something you build in even to this meeting management protocol. Not so sure that's where it goes and that it might go as part of a larger discussion about the agenda construction, but you can put it there if you want, anyway. I'm just suggesting it might be something taken up separately because there's a lot of different parts to the agenda, that might get affected, by that. And so it might warrant an independent discussion, but I heard you loud and clear on that. I get you, I heard you struggling with the concept of efficiency of meetings and the desire to have robust, deliberation at the same time. And that you in fact like the current process for questions, but are certainly open to modifying that and developing a more formal rule on questions. So again, I think consensus there. I don't understand a lot of Robert's rules either. The concept and I understand them, but they don't always make sense in their practical application. And the concept that the body owns the motion is really the idea that is once there's a motion and there's a second, that it's not within the purview of the person making motion or the second to actually change that any longer. It would have to be some action taken by the body itself with respect to that motion or second. Obviously subject to the idea of making a friendly amendment, which one person can make as opposed to the overall body itself. So again, Robert's much more technical, Rosenberg's, and again, as that may be modified, by all of you, more pragmatic, I think, and that's further evidence of that. Your comment on the concept of enforcement of different policies, like the ones on the kind of statements people might make, right, or the interruption and everything else. And you don't like censure or admonishment, and that really wouldn't be able to happen there anyway, right? And the censure and admonishment policy, really about a lot of that is appeals to the chair, and the chair recognizing that either he or she, is out of line, or that whoever is being pointed out is out of line in what their comments are, and that a determination is made by the presiding, officer at that time, subject to appeal from the group. So there is a process, for that. I think you've done it a time, or two on a matter of procedure. It's hard to do in the subjective areas where it's intentions or criticism or personal statements. It's just hard. And I'm not telling you I've got a magic, response for that. Some of this boils down to everyone committing, right, to not be that way, right, and to try to hold each other, accountable for that, as opposed to exchanging, having it get, out of control. And so, but there is technically a policy for that could be identified as a point of order and appealed and, an approval by the group. So there are mechanisms built in, but it is absolutely challenging in that subjective area where it's not a bright line, kind of rule of procedure. I think those were your comments, Member Jane, and questions. Member Chahal, Rosenberg's, does it cover ambiguities? I think Rosenberg's is pretty complete. I think it really, even if it's only 7 pages, I really think it deals with pretty much everything I've seen you have to grapple with. Just when I think, though, I've seen it all, something comes up, that I haven't seen, before, and we need to sort it out. And so the answer to your question would be, to the extent your policies or Rosenberg's doesn't deal with something, how would that, be resolved? And the answer would be, in my view, that the presiding officer would make, kind of a suggestion, interpretation, or an approach to that. I would provide advice, right, on, if solicited, on what, what a logical approach might be consistent with the overall, themes of Rosenberg's and participation and things like that. And that ultimately, if you didn't like what the presiding officer said or my advice, it would be subject to the majority deciding what the rule should be in that case. So that's how ambiguities would be dealt with, or where Rosenberg's doesn't speak to a particular issue. You talked about 2/3 vote rules, in Rosenberg's, and whether or not you could all change that. 100% you could. When I suggesting Rosenberg's and tendering it, to you as a good starting place, and a good model, it's not to say that your only choice is to accept it wholesale or not. You can accept the parts of it that you like, and you could modify the parts of it that you like. For example, and again, we'll have to ultimately reconcile some of these things. The motion for reconsideration process in Rosenberg's is different than your much more detailed, elaborate motion for a reconsideration process. How do you ultimately, reconcile those things? You can make local rules and amendments to Rosenberg's. It's not kind of an all or nothing, proposition. You talked about also concurring with you. Don't like the idea of a motion having to be absolutely necessary right out of the gate. I'm seeing that as a matter of consensus. You talked about follow-up questions being allowed. We talked about that. And then I think we already talked about the no personal attacks. How do you solve that? Who monitors? Getting along better is maybe a separate, subject that could be taken up. But, having rules that people agree with and that they respect, administered by the presiding officer, subject to overrule by the majority, is really from a rulemaking standpoint, the standard of how that should work. And so those are my responses to the comments and questions. Mr. Chair, back to you. Still would be interested in if you're at a phase, where you're comfortable enough to say, hey, staff, city attorney, come back in September. We like Rosenberg's as a starting point, but we also want to make sure you address, these things. And I can, work on that and put that together and have something more actual in writing, right, for you to look at as opposed to conceptual for your next meeting.
Thank you very much. Committee, back to you.
I don't know that there is a great place to put public comments, but, and I'm very familiar with a foolish consistency. But in the case of a planning commission and a city council, I think that it would be nice if there was some consistency between at least those two meetings. Because I do see, and I do hear about, missed opportunities to speak because it's not like they were used to doing in planning commission. I also know that rules need to cover not just what's possible. Sorry, they need to cover what's possible, not just what we would like. And I think that that's, with any rule system, we have the problem of what if you have a bad chair? And I think that in some cases, if there's any kind of elucidation, if there's any kind of detail, if there's any kind of things that we'd like to add, I would like to consider what happens when we do have a bad chair, when we've got we've had bad advice from city attorneys that have told us that something is not possible or something has to run a certain way, and it's not been true. Not necessarily recently, but we've had this in the past. And without any way to appeal that, it just looks like the rest of the council members, the rest of the committee members are trying to take over the meeting, when in fact, we're simply trying to bring up a point of order that should be managed in a way, but is not being managed. I hear about personal attacks and even personal behavior. And I'm going to tell you, I sit right there. And I love that seat because I can see all of council and I can see city manager and city attorney right in front of me and right on that wall. And I read it every so often when I'm hearing things that I don't necessarily think are in line with those rules. We hear about being polite and all these other things. And for the most part, I try. So again, I know that these are not things that are actually the role of city attorney or city attorney staff. But again, there has to be some way to at least give input to what's happening, even if there's no possible enforcement of that. It would be so much better to the public if, in fact, there were somebody acting in the role of parliamentarian without the ability to enforce, simply stating, this is what the rules are. This is a reminder of this is how public discourse should be had. That the purpose of this meeting is for robust discussion, not personal attacks, and for public input. It would be nice if we had some way to do that. And I feel that by coming up with a rule system and not addressing enforcement or not addressing what happens when there are breaks in the process, then it doesn't matter which rule system you have. The rule system that we have, we don't even follow, and it kind of works for us. And where it breaks the same places that any rule system would break without guidance, enforcement, etc. Thank you.
Committee Member Jain.
I'm happy to make a motion, I guess, if you want. I will move that we move towards adopting Rosenberg's rules for our meeting management. I think we mostly follow them anyway. My comment is that during the pilot, we did actually adopt that 3 questions would be asked per council member, and there would only be 1 round. But that, that was, pilot was only supposed to go for 6 months. We've actually been pretty much following that concept, even though it expired, in terms of, I haven't seen this anywhere else where all the council members ask their questions without getting any answers and then having another round. That doesn't happen anywhere else. We suggested that for the pilot, and we've been following it ever since. So the pilot is still sort of in effect. What we've changed is that we have multiple rounds. So we're somewhere in between. That's my comment, but I do like the idea of having more of an interactive discussion when we ask questions. I think other agencies do have that, but I like the efficiency of just asking my questions. I've gotten used to doing that at VTA board meetings. I just fire off all my questions without asking a question and getting a response, asking a question, getting a response. So I like the efficiency of that.
So my comment to that is, like, if that's the way that works for you, then 100% feel free to use it. But I don't think that it should be imposed upon people who have a more discussion, like we have a more dialogue type of a method or process or a way of giving input. And again, nothing prevents people from being more efficient themselves, but to enforce a imagined efficiency on everyone, I think that is a problem. I think that, again, what we need to look at is not the process first, but we need to look at the point of the meetings first, which is robust discussion, robust dialogue. It is for public input, and it is for coming up with, and coming up with a good solution or the best solution. And in some cases, sometimes the input that people bring up, including the public, requires me to ask more questions, because now I am trying to process information I don't have more background on. And I think limiting the ability of that to ask questions, given that very real and often occurring possibility, is, I don't agree with that. That said, I don't think I think that was a comment in Committee Member Jane's motion. I think his motion was to move toward adopting Rosenberg. Yeah.
That's correct, to move towards adopting Rosenberg, because it's essentially what we're following. And in terms of amendments and such. And I'm not sure, I'm going to make the motion that we split the public comment period to something like, and it could be to the chair's discretion, how much time based on who's there, but it would be a limit of, say, 21 minutes in the first round. And then the balance of the public comments go to the end of the meeting. And that's pretty much it.
Okay, before we take your motion, I think there's a public, we should go to the public, and there is somebody in the public who wants to say.
Thank you, Chair. We have 2 hands raised. So let me go ahead and start with the first one, Dr. Tom Shanks. Hold on. Can you hear us, Dr. Shanks? Please unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I just figured that out. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I was just gonna say that on the notion of splitting the public comment, I'm wondering how that's in the best interests of the public and how that will build public trust for you guys. It seems to me that this is not a good time to put the public comments at the end of the meeting when everyone is exhausted and very few people are listening. So that's my major concern. Thank you.
Thank you.
You have Wanda?
Hi, I support you in making changes for better meetings, but this meeting is an example that we need more meetings because there's a lot to cover. And I'm not sure which of these rules or laws will be most efficient time-wise. And it isn't just about the time, however, it's about doing the business of the city. And I have a lot more to say, and we're already over on this meeting. I am going to send an email to the mayor and council, and I hope that you all read it. And thank you for working on this. Good luck.
Thank you, Wanda.
That's all we have.
That's all you have. Okay, before we go, like, I would like to comment on, I think, two topics. We were talking about the public comment item and the management of the question answer session. I think for the question answer session, I would have a hybrid approach. Once we have question posed to the presenter while he is presenting, after that, it should be interactive. That's my approach. Like after that, once he start answering at that stage, it should be interactive and other people should be able to ask question on the fly, basically. That's my suggestion. And the second thing, public comments. Historically, if we look at it, like on average, we don't have more than 2 or 3 public comments, if I'm not mistaken. So even if we limit, and we face this issue of public comments when we had a particular topics which were very controversial from one point or the other, or very people were very enthusiastic to present themselves on those topics. That's the time where we are talking about, and that happens maybe once in a 6 months or something like that. And for that matter, I would suggest that we follow the time, like, and as Mr. Shanks mentioned, we don't want public comments to be at the end of the meeting. That defeats the purpose of it. The way we have right now is close to after our consent calendar. I think that's the appropriate time to have that. But I'm of the opinion we should put a limit to it. Maybe staff can come back with it. You have 21 minutes for Chula Vista or 30 minutes for somebody. So we can come back with, but I'm okay with it. Like, as long as we are not defeating the purpose of regular presenters in a case, only in case of when we have a heavy presentation, public presentation, where it's a different topic, then we can manage it according to our rules, basically, for that matter. So those are, and I do support Rosenberg because it's very concise and easy to understand and follow right away, basically. But at the same time, I want some of the policies, which staff is much better as handling, because you have seen what's going on in these meetings for last few years, basically, or you can watch the previous meetings also if you want to have some more fun and come up with our own policies which suit us, following Rosenberg, and come up with our own policy changes, basically. That's that. So those are my comments on that. Committee Member Park.
Yeah, I mean, before we had the public input, I was going to suggest that moving all public comment to the end, it seems like a very nice idea, but when we have the case where we've got people that we would like to take input from that cannot stay until midnight, until 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. I mean, there are cases like that. And I think that we need to, rather than have a hard and fast rule, if it's going to take, if we have a limit of 21 minutes or 30 minutes, and it's going to take maybe 35 minutes, I don't know that we would want to limit that. I would rather take the 35 minutes, but as Chair Chahal suggested, when we do have meetings where we've got lots of people lined up to give input, then maybe we could set, or we could, try to set up policy to handle those types of meetings. Maybe we say that for different topics, if it's about this topic, we'll limit the number of people that can speak, and we'll, move this out towards later. But we would like every single topic to have some air, so to speak, when people are coming to city council, right? If you've got 7 people talking about 7 different things, and you've got 20 people on one topic potentially, then maybe we'd like to hear all 7 different things and a number of the people who are talking on the one topic, and then tell them, well, we can agendize this, we can do this. Maybe there's a better way to do this. But I also think that we should have a better process than simply moving people to the end, because who knows when these council meetings end.
Oh, yeah, Commitment Jen.
I think, what I've found is that when we do have these very lengthy public comment sessions, then the business of the city is done at a very late stage when people are not making good decisions. When people are tired. So it doesn't actually serve the public to have those important decisions be made so late. That's what I'm trying to circumvent.
Yeah. Okay, so we have, unless staff has any comments to counter comments, we can.
I think I've got enough based on both the direction to move towards Rosenberg's and some other kind of consensus observations that I made in order to put something together for your consideration next meeting, if that's the committee's druthers. Okay. So I heard a motion. I don't know that I heard a second. Oh, yep.
Yeah, I was going to second, given that, which is I do agree. I mean, again, I don't care about the rule system. I am more concerned about how do we enforce, how do we, guide based on those rules, because like we don't follow the rules right now. I mean, we don't strictly follow the rules right now, and we seem to work with that. And the problems that I have are not the rule system. The problems that I have are what happens when we step out, when we have, outliers to the process. But again, I think that's a forever problem. Not going to stop me from making a second to this motion.
Okay.
And to be clear, I don't think that committee member Jane was suggesting that these are the hard and fast numbers. He was suggesting that there would be, some consideration of how the public comment would be done. And if that's the case, I will wholeheartedly support that.
Okay. You want to say something? No, okay, thank you. So with that motion, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? None. Okay, motion passes 3-0. Thank you, City Attorney. Okay, moving forward, we have item number 4, 24-650, update on review of SCSC Chapter 2.155, regulation of lobbying activities, and SCSC Chapter 2.160, calendars of certain city officials. And I request City Attorney Glenn Goggins.
Yeah, very, very quickly, so we can get to the next item, which I think we do want some input and action on. This is a holdover item from some number of years ago now that we're bringing back, that was brought back to you to conform the lobbyist reporting rules with the public calendar, requirements. When we talked about this last March, both staff and the committee identified other potential issues with the lobbyist, registration ordinance generally, and most notably the costs and the mechanisms for enforcement of, how it works in general. And based on that input, we're in the process of conducting an analysis to determine staffing needs, for the enforcement of the lobbyist ordinance. We're identifying other issues that there might be, with it. And we're benchmarking other jurisdictions' ordinances to understand how other jurisdictions manage these regulate these matters. we are proposing that this item, be a work in progress and that we continue to work on do that work and bring it back to you at the earliest possible date. I don't have a date on that yet. We've got a bunch of other things going on, so I don't want to commit to September, but I think it would be realistic for us to come back to you at your December, meeting with a more fulsome analysis of the issues you asked us to look at. And so no actions necessary, Mr. Chair. If there's a consensus on staff's approach, we're happy with that and can move to the next item.
Okay, thank you. Committee, yeah.
So I reviewed the meetings of the Governance and Ethics Committee from June 7th of 2021, when we had a robust discussion of this lobbyist ordinance and calendaring. And, I'll just recap. Brian Doyle, our previous attorney, said that the lobbyist reports are ineffective. And Hossam Hagag, our city clerk, had said that he could not find a single example of a lobbyist application that was filled out appropriately. All are pretty poorly filled out. My concern is that when we do the calendaring, I've noticed that on calendars, I've looked at a number of calendars, and lobbyists are not always indicated on council members' public calendars. It's a little onerous to have every time I meet with somebody to go check the lobbyist list to see if they're really a lobbyist. They don't announce themselves to be lobbyists when I meet with them. So I don't know how we resolve that issue, because according to our ordinance, we're supposed to record when a lobbyist, we have a meeting with the lobbyist. And then what we had finally concluded at that meeting is what you're supposed to report is just sort of the nature of the meeting, the general nature of the meeting. And if a lobbyist makes an ask, that you would actually report what they asked you for, approve my project or whatever it is. So just as you're moving forward to guide you in how you approach this, but the thing that disturbed me at that meeting was that we have monthly public calendars that we do as council members, and they wanted lobbyists to submit reports every month to try to coincide what the lobbyists are saying with what the council members are saying. And I'd like to understand what the staffing requirements are to do that and what the effort is to check on all of that and hound the lobbyists to make sure they're submitting these reports, which so far have been pretty ineffective anyway.
Thank you. Understood. Appreciate that input.
You have a comment on that? Yeah, okay. Committeeman Park? Okay, I'll make a brief comment. I also reviewed the past minutes and details. There was one thing, was standard reporting template. We talked about it. I think having that template, both for lobbyists as well as for the city council and all those people who have to have a calendar published, basically, that would really help. Because there were a lot of controversy thing, oh, this was not mentioned, but this name was mentioned like that. So just have a standard template. If you can bring that forward, that would be good. That's my only suggestion on that. Thank you. Thank you. So with that, you don't need, anyone from public? No hand raised.
There are no hands raised.
Okay, so you don't need any motion, you just had a brief discussion and.
We don't. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll keep working on this and try to get it back in front of you
Okay,
soon.
thank you very much. Okay, good. Okay, moving forward, last item on the agenda, item number 5, review and action on updated 2024 governance and ethics work plan. City Manager Joanne Grogan.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Jahal. Just want to go over a few slides to review the remaining work plan for this year. So as the committee knows, we first talked about this work plan at your March 4th meeting. This was also agendized for June 3rd, but due to time, we did not get to that item, and so it was re-agendized for this meeting. So you have two more regularly scheduled meetings this year, September 16th and December 24th. And I will actually mention an update to both of these for two items that we discussed today that one will roll to or be brought back up on September 16th and the other for December 2nd. So your current work plan for September 16th, your next meeting is to receive an informational report on the city's ethics documents review. You may recall that the city council directed staff to do a review of all of the city's ethics documents as well as your behavioral standards. That is not a work plan item of this committee. The city council specifically directed it to go back to the city council, but we will provide an informational report to the Government and Ethics Committee, but staff was directed to, once we concluded that work, to work with the full city council. The next item is an informational report on options for text message retention that was referred from your March 4th meeting of this year. Next is an informational report on commission, board, and committees recruitment process. And so we will provide an update on how people are recruited for that. That was a request. The next item is an update on your city council policy 020 proclamations, commendations, and certificates of recognition. And this was referred from your June 3rd meeting of this year, specifically to return to this committee to talk about mayoral certificates of recognition and any criteria that the committee desires to propose for mayoral certificates of recognition. Remember at the June meeting, we had a discussion and there was a concept or desire from the committee to look into allowing district council members to sign mayoral certificates of recognitions, and staff mentioned at that time that we wanted to do a little bit more research. And so we will return at your September 16th meeting. The next item that is not there, so a fifth item that we will add, is coming back on meeting management protocol. And so that was item 3 on today's agenda. And so that will come back on your September 16th meeting. Next, on December 2nd, we will review the City Council Policy 043, official travel for elected officials, and Policy 006, Commissioner travel. And then also referred from this meeting, which we will add, is coming back on Chapter 2.155, lobbyist activities for your December meeting, as the city attorney just mentioned for in item 4 on today's agenda. Next slide. There are a number of other items that the committee has discussed or individual committee members have mentioned. And so they are up here. These are tentative dates subject to the committee approval. There's quite a bit on this work plan for us to accomplish. And so we would want to engage you in a discussion of that, but there are an additional 6 items here. The first one would be adding an item to the September meeting to review and discuss city council district communications options. That would be September 16th. Next would be a review and discussion of policy, of a policy limiting resolutions on matters outside of the city council jurisdiction for the December 2nd meeting. The third item potentially would be discuss a potential ordinance on prohibiting campaign contributions from foreign influenced business entities, again, December 2nd. Consider the number 4, consideration of provision for healthcare for city council members after leaving office, December 2nd. Tracking of district level services and spending per district, December 2nd. Review of council policy 050, gifts to elected officials and appointed officials requested by the city attorney's office for December 2nd. Quite a few items. So if we were to add item 1, that will now be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 items on September. And then if we were to add the remaining 5 items to the 2 items, that will be another 7, that will be 7 total items for December 2nd. So quite a heavy work plan for staff to accomplish. And so some of these may roll into 2025. But with that, just a informational, a report, and then looking for committee direction on if the 6 items on this slide you would like us to proceed with. And staff would, of course, endeavor to do so, but as I mentioned, may not be able to be accomplished given the amount of items for your meetings. Thank you.
I have a question, City Manager. You mentioned that we are bringing update on Council Policy 020 for proclamations. Didn't we decide that we're moving that to August City Council?
Yes.
The minutes, I was going through the minutes also. So is it part of it we are bringing back or?
The committee did take action to move forward a change to that policy to the city council, and we are moving that forward. However, the committee also desired to potentially make a change to how mayoral certificates are awarded, and staff mentioned that we needed additional time to research and analyze that. And so the amendments that were approved by the committee are moving forward to the city council. If in fact, after our discussion on September 16th, there are additional amendments, we would then forward those to the city council for approval.
Okay, okay. And if you have that information by August, would it be appropriate to present to the council or you won't have it?
I think we won't have it, and I think it would be appropriate to come back to the committee for discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the clarification. Okay. The committee?
I had a couple of items, which I know it's a very busy work plan, and but there was something that came up where I was staying at the official convention hotel in Washington, DC for NCPA, and I have a guest rewards program with that hotel, but the council has a policy where the points or whatever don't come to the council members. And so it turns out in reality, it's been happening where people get the frequent flyer rewards for flying and for staying in hotels and such. And I know it could be perverted. You could take a more expensive flight because you have points on that, but it's something that, you know, since I was staying at the official hotel, I should have gotten the points. And eventually I did, but it's sort of against policy.
Sure. So not aware of that particular instance. I am aware of our city travel policy for city employees. I will say that that clause is really a holdover for times where reward programs would allow the agency or the business entity to have the rewards. I know we have had preliminary conversations with regard to our city employee travel policy on the ability to effectively track that, and is it even possible for the agency to have a reward membership that's tied to the agency's name? Most, for example, hotels now, the rewards go to the person, the same thing for airlines. And so there's no longer the ability to have a agency or business entity reward program. So we on the staff side, have had preliminary conversations and may look into changing that. But I think when we talk about the 020 policy in December, we can address that, or I'm sorry, 006 travel for.
That's what I was thinking.
043. 043 official travel for elected officials.
Mhm. That's it. Thank you.
So a comment about that is I have a staff book all of my travel and do all of my hotels for the explicit or express purpose of not having any of my personal. So I mean, that's the reason that I do that. But I realized that when we were, asked I think that the survey or the travel policy information to city council where we give passport information, things like that, it does ask for rewards. It does ask for membership things. I have changed some of my membership numbers specifically to not get rewards there. But one of the problems that I have is if there has to be a change or if there is a problem with a booking, I wasn't notified when I had to make a change. I wasn't notified of any changes because it went to staff. Like it literally went to mayor and council or some other email address. I just think that this policy needs to be looked at. I think that if it's possible to get the rewards under a council address and not retain them for public use, for personal use after serving, I think that would be beneficial to the city as well. Like again, if our all travel booked for, like I don't book personal travel under my council email, for example, but I just think that there should be a policy where we can get direct information so that we can talk to the agencies that have our bookings, that have our, but right now I realize it's a two-step process. Sometimes I have to call staff and say, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm in front of the hotel. This is what they're telling me. And I don't know if there's a better way to look at that. Like there's got to be a better way to look at that.
I think we can bring, when the policy comes back for discussion, at that time, we can have a full-fledged discussion on that.
That, and I think that part of what you're describing as a implementation and a operational item, and so we can talk about that. I think certainly there's the ability for council members' contact information to be placed on a hotel or airline reservation so you can be notified. And I think we can send an appointment with staff and talk offline about that.
No, understood. And I'm just saying in the private sector, we have this concept of a company card and company other, company benefits, company email address, company phone, and anything that's done with the company is through that. And I just feel that maybe we could look into how the private sector, other agencies are tracking agency-specific travel and hotel arrangements independent from personal. I mean, there's a lot of work that could be done there. I also hear, and I saw the message from the city manager on the public speaking changes coming, I think, before council in August. And my understanding was that when this was going to be brought forward, it would be brought forward sooner than August. This was, almost a month ago exactly when we had this in. I was kind of hoping that we can get it in by the break, but I think August is probably good. But again, some of these are timely. I mean, I understand that it's not on this city attorney and this city manager that a lot of these items came in. But from a work perspective and from a council perspective, some of these items, we've been waiting where I've been waiting for almost 3 years. And I think that needs to be taken into account. Stuff like how do we notice, how do we talk to our districts? That's going to come at the end of our terms. And this is something that was brought up almost immediately when I took office and realized there are no ways for me to address my constituents through the city. So I just want to bring that up. Meaning that yes, public speaking changes are moving forward, but not in any way to benefit us during a really nice time. Like last year when we had public night out and I wasn't taken to a single one of my district's events, there was no way for me to tell them. I had to go to them one by one, or I have to go to them one by one to do that. As public speaker said, Wanda Buck said, as this meeting shows, when we talk about meeting management, we need a lot more meetings. I look at the timing of some of these items. I understand the reason that we have these items is because, well, these are the next scheduled meetings and we have staff time we have to worry about, but this affects my time too. I mean, I'm literally not paid to be here during work hours by the city. I mean, I'm paid something, but a lot of that money that I'm being paid goes towards other things like paying for events. And things like that, paying for, but it sounds like we need to look at what the business of the city requires. And if the business of the city requires more meetings or more time, then that's what I think we need to be thinking about. It would be really nice to fit things into things that are already scheduled, but the reality is the last meeting on June 3rd, we deferred a lot of items, and the stated reason was we spent 2.5 hours on 2 items. We just completed 2 items. This meeting, we're going well over 30 minutes, an average of 30 minutes per item. And if we had said, well, let's average 30 minutes per item for the June 3rd meeting, we would have been at over 3.5 hours, 3.5 hours or more. I think that meeting management certainly needs to be looked at, but if time is the issue, if people don't want to have 3-hour meetings, 4-hour meetings, then maybe the reality is we need to look into more meetings to get the work of the city done. And the fact that we're backlogged is not, your fault. It's not anyone's fault, but we've had a lot of these items for a long time. And perhaps to clear the backlog, we need to say, well, in order to clear this backlog and address the issues that have been literally around for years, maybe we need to have a few extra meetings. I mean, I'm on the economics and marketing subcommittee, and we haven't met literally for over 2 years now. There's no updates. We've hired a DMO during that time. We've had lots of changes into how we do marketing for the city, and we have not had a single marketing, meeting, economic meeting, subcommittee meeting. And I think that we need to look into not just what staff time is, it's our time too, but how do we get the input? How would we get the information that we need? How do we have the forums to ask the questions that we have so that we can look into the business of the city? I mean, these are all things. Again, agenda meeting management, a big thing. If the agenda says that this meeting is going to take 3 hours and we don't want to allocate 3 hours, maybe we need to have more meetings. And that's a serious, I don't want to have more meetings, but I do want to get the work of the city done. Thank you.
So John,
Staff is looking for, through the chair, I'm sorry. Staff is looking for action on the additional work plan items that are on slide 3. We have tentative dates. Again, understand that there are a number of items backlogged, understand that these will be long meetings. I will say in general, there's a lot of business and work of the city and the capacity and the bandwidth is not there to accomplish everything that everybody wants to accomplish, as well as do the normal day-to-day operations and oversight of this very large and complex agency. Not to mention, and I know it's not agendized to go into all of the other frozen positions and other workload items we have, as well as council priority initiatives. And so totally understand we're talking about one component of a very large system. And so staff did put tentative dates here because we will attempt, if the council or if the committee still wants to move forward with those 6 items for the balance of your meetings this year. But they take time because staff has to research and analyze and prepare for each of those items so that you can have a conversation that is informed and be prepared to make action and not just provide general feedback. Because as you said, I think these items have been around for a long time. It's the work that needs to be done to bring them to you as a body so that you can take action.
I would suggest let's target those dates. And if we have some change of plan because of the staff and other issues coming up, we can make a change after that. But as of now, we agreed that let's bring this as per the dates you proposed.
Do we need a motion? I move to approve this work plan.
I would second, but I would like staff to look at, if we need to, instead of having fewer, longer meetings, and having to wait, I would like to look into what other meetings we could have. This is a special meeting, for example. And again, I know that it is, a burden on anyone that has to come here, but I have to come here too. And I will second the motion.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? With that, any other comments from the staff? I think we adjourn for the day. We have to make a motion. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate all you have. Yeah, please. Okay. Thank you.